all so much for being here this morning. I'm Janelle.
I'm Naomi.
I'm Winnie.
I'm Amadou.
And we're members of the Stanford Public Policy Senior Practicum team. For the past 10 weeks, we've been working with the Redwood City Housing and Human Concerns Committee in order to come up with strategies to retain naturally occurring affordable housing within Redwood City. So to get us started, this is just a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. So first we'll start with a little background on the housing context in Redwood City. Then we'll move into our policy problem and how we define our project scope. After that, we'll talk about our recommendations, including a little bit of how we performed our analysis and any potential limitations. We'll then go into a summary of our findings and future considerations for the client. So to get us started, I'm sure it's no surprise to any of you all in this room that housing affordability is a major concern, not only in Redwood City, but in the Bay Area in general. So we have a figure from Zillow which estimated the median home value in Redwood City at $1.6 million through the end of 2018. And rents are similarly very expensive, so a one-bedroom going for around $2,800. And lastly, a group of researchers at UC Berkeley, when examining Bay Area counties, found that between 2000 and 2015, San Mateo County lost 44% of its non-subsidized affordable housing. So given just a few of those facts and figures, housing like this is perhaps more important than ever. So this is a property at 1512 Stafford Street in Redwood City, and we would identify this housing as naturally occurring affordable housing. So a longtime Redwood City resident named Christina purchased this property as an investment in the early 90s. And throughout her time owning the property, she intentionally set rents that were below market rates for the 7 apartment units at this property. And she really set these lower rates because she wanted to make sure that these units were affordable to her tenants, who she had strong community ties to. So as I mentioned, this is a naturally occurring affordable housing unit. And here's just a quick definition of what we mean by naturally occurring affordable housing. It's also known as NOAA housing, so if you hear NOAA a lot through the presentation, this is what we mean. So this is privately owned housing that is charged below market rate rents without government subsidies. And as I mentioned, Christina charged below market rate rents as she owned this property. And a couple of years ago, Christina decided to leave the rental housing market in Redwood City and actually sold that property to HIP Housing, which is a nonprofit housing developer in the area, and she sold it to the nonprofit so that they could maintain housing affordability in the long term. So from our research, we've gathered that there's a few characteristics that are usually associated with these NOAA units. One, they're usually older properties. They usually have fewer amenities, and also the properties usually are smaller in size. So these are not, buildings that usually have 100 and plus more units in them. And another thing to consider is that usually there's one owner of these properties. It's not usually owned by LLC or a big corporation. So I'll turn it over to Amadou with our policy problem.
So that leads us to the following policy question. What policies can Redwood City implement to maximize the retention of NOAA multifamily housing? In terms of the scope of this project, we did want to focus on preservation, and we're focusing on 2 income groups in particular, low and moderate income earners, because when you look at the very low income earners and above moderate income earners, there tends to be a lot of housing development and a lot of focus on them. So we wanted to focus on these 2 groups in particular. And just to remind you guys, NOAA units receive no federal or state subsidies. So here you have a chart. This is from the housing element, and this talks about households experiencing, households that are cost burdened. So when we talk about housing affordability, we refer to, or we're thinking about people who are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. So here you had a total households experiencing cost burden was 12,000. This data is kind of old in a way. So we actually looked at even newer data that showed that number is now around 15,000. So it has increased over the years. Here you have a breakdown of the different groups, low, moderate, and the median. And when we look at housing affordability, we do look at the average median income, and our source is HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So if you actually look at the maximum income limits for a single individual, if you look at the median, you're looking at around $83,000 made in a year. And the affordable rent cost, or 30% of that, if you divide it monthly, should be $2,072. But if you look at the average rent for a one bedroom, it's at around $2,800. So people at the low, moderate income levels, they can't afford to live within the city. And like I said before, 15,000, almost half of the people that live in Redwood City can't actually afford to live there. And furthermore, we talked to the Redwood City staff, and we looked at values around construction. How much does it cost to develop affordable housing and even market rate housing within the city? So for market rate housing, you're looking at $500K per unit compared to $700K per unit when looking at affordable housing. And we're looking at the timeline, looking at from application to occupancy. You go from 3 years with market rate housing to 7 to 10 years with affordable rate housing. So we decided that that was out of scope, and to prevent displacement, we want to focus on retention and preservation of NOAA units. So preservation is actually cheaper. You're going from $500K to $300K, $400K per unit. And in terms of timeline, you're going from years to 6 months. So we definitely did want to focus on this.
So to give a little bit of context about how we frame this problem, as Amadou already mentioned, our focus is specifically on preservation of existing affordable housing units. And we realize that construction is necessary, but we focus specifically on preservation and how to mitigate displacement that is happening now. And for the past 10 weeks, we've noted that there are two important factors to helping combat displacement. One is improved data to identify where these affordable housing units are in order to target support to make sure that they're able to retain affordability. And secondly, the city and other partnering entities need the money enabled in order to acquire these units and maintain their affordability within the long term. And it's important to note that one potential policy solution to combat displacement that other cities have taken is rent control. So neighboring cities like East Palo Alto have implemented rent control measures, but Redwood City, talking to the committee and their city council, they've let us know that rent control is especially off the table. So none of our recommendations that we show will be related to that.
So now we'll get into the survey and recommendations portion of our presentation. So our policy options were evaluated on these commonly used criteria in public policy, but for the scope of our project, we took the following definitions. When we talk about effectiveness, we're looking at whether our strategies help to actually retain NOAA units. When we looked at efficiency, we're trying to see if housing was optimally allocated while minimizing the costs and foregone revenues. And when we looked at feasibility, we looked at political, legal, economic, and financial constraints and factors. These criteria were used to identify, narrow, and refine the scope of our project, following the feedback that we got from the Housing and Human Concerns Committee, as well as the additional analysis that we've carried out following our midterm review. We'll go into greater depth as to how our policies fare or were weighted against these criteria later on in our presentation.
Great. So I'll start us off with one deliverable we'll present to the client, which is a landlord survey. And as its icon shows, the main, goal with this survey is to improve the data collection around multifamily rental units within Redwood City. So as I mentioned, this addresses a data shortage, and we believe that's important in order to have more informed policy making. And the way the survey is currently drafted, it targets multifamily rental properties in the city in general. And I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the targeting of the survey. But the questions that we have help us to get at these three, buckets to better understand property characteristics. So it asks for things such as unit size in the property and also average rents that are being charged. There's a few questions about tenant characteristics. And lastly, we believe the survey is a powerful tool in order to gain insights from the owners, including what their future plans for the property are and common experiences and also expenses they face in the Redwood City rental housing market. So in addition to a drafted survey template, we've also identified a list of landlords within the city that we believe may be these NOAA landlords in charge below market rate rents. And so for convenience sake, we have listed in our memorandum 20 properties. We're sure there are a lot more, but for convenience sake, we just plotted these 20 properties on this map, which are identified by the red dots. And these 20 properties in total have 136 units. And also on this map, we have plotted deed restricted affordable housing, which has already been identified by the city as affordable. And that's about a total of 700 of those deed restricted units. So I'll just zoom in a little bit more until where some of these potential NOAA units are concentrated. So they're, as you can see, not too far from downtown. The bigger the circle, the more units that are on a specific property. So as you can see, we believe these potential NOAA properties have smaller unit sizes, which is one of the characteristics of NOAA that we've identified earlier. And with the written memorandum that we present to the client next week, it will have the property addresses of these properties, so that if the committee wishes to follow up with some of these property owners, they can do so. So a few potential limitations as a result of the survey. One is potentially targeting the survey. So we believe it's necessary to gather insights, especially about NOAA properties, given that these are the properties we want to target and craft incentives around in order to support them and make sure they're able to retain affordable units. However, there is no one database in Redwood City that identifies all NOAA property owners. So we hope that the 20 properties that we list can be a good starting point to this, that the committee can reach out to and hopefully get good feedback from. And secondly, there are concerns around data collection and privacy. We recommend that the committee consult with the city attorney just to make sure that they're clear on any sharing requirements as a result of like freedom of information, and as the information is being collected by the city, they may have to share that data if requested to do so, and making sure that respondents are very clear at the beginning of the survey what their data will be used for and how it will be stored and potentially shared.
So now we're getting at the first one of our recommendations, which is looking at redesigning the business license application. So what is a business license application? So what it is that all businesses based or operating within Redwood City are required to register with the city's Administrative Services Department. And if you are a real estate rental property within the city, the amount of information that is asked of you is the number of square feet if you're a commercial property, or the number of units if you're a residential property. And these two metrics are then used as the basis of the fee that is applied to the business licenses. While looking at the fiscal year 2017 to 2018, we were able to see that the total revenues associated with the business license was about 2.6 million. But since this is associated with all businesses, not just residential properties, we wanted to figure out what is the specific contribution coming from multifamily residential properties. And with the help of the SUS data, we were able to calculate that to be around 180K, which is about 7% of that total 2.6 million account. The way we got at this is by taking all the properties that are in excess of 3 units, that are multifamily residential units, and applying this fee stated here, which is 24 for each excessive unit above 3. So now that we've seen what the business license application is, what is our recommendation? So our recommendation has 2 steps. The first and the most important is modifying the business license application to ask businesses to disclose information on gross receipts. Now what does this get at? This gets at the data collection piece that we mentioned. As Janelle said earlier, there is no database that exists currently that has all the information on no units and where they are. So by adding this line on the business license application, asking these businesses to disclose how much their gross receipts are, we can get more accurate and sustained data on rental revenues being charged per unit, so we can begin to have a better idea of who's a NOAA property and who's a market rate or above market rate unit. we looked at a number of cities within San Mateo County that are already carrying out this. So the first two, Belmont and Millbrae, have a similar fee schedule to Redwood City currently, where they base their fee on the number of units or square feet, but they do have a line on their business license asking for gross receipts. And then next three cities, Menlo Park, San Mateo, and East Palo Alto, also ask for this information, but in addition, they also base their fee on the gross receipts, which gets at the second step of our recommendation, which is modifying the business license application to base their fee on gross receipts. Now, I've been mentioning gross receipts a lot, so some people may be wondering what that is. So what I have here is a simple definition that was combined from various cities that I highlighted before, and they take gross receipts to be just the total amount charged or received from the sale of goods or services performed. This encapsulates all receipts, cash, credits, and property without any deductions. And the way it's calculated is in two methods, which is either the percentage rate or a flat fee with a sliding scale. So adapting this business license fee to a gross receipts model kind of starts to get at the revenue collection piece, since it's able to generate more revenue. So now, while looking at the first step, I understand that it may be hard to conceptualize what this looks like, so we added some excerpts from the cities so that people can see what this looks like in practice. So this is an excerpt from the Belmont business license application. As you can see at the top here, we have how their fee is calculated. And what it looks like to just add this additional line is just one more line on the form asking the businesses to disclose their estimated gross receipts. Now, if we move to the other cities that base their fee on gross receipts, this is what their fee schedule looked like. This is Menlo Park, and as we can see here, it's based on a flat fee, and the fee increases as your gross receipts go up. Similarly, we have another excerpt from the San Mateo business license, which is based on the same assumptions and calculations. So what does it look like to ask for this information on these particular business licenses? So once again, we thought it would be useful to help visualize what this looks like by putting an excerpt from the San Mateo gross receipt business license. And what this looks like is they have their own definition of what they mean gross receipts, and then they have this line asking the business to disclose either their estimated gross receipts if they're a new business, or their actual ones from the previous year if they have already been operating within the city. So some of you might be wondering, how do we ensure that if we transform the business license to this gross receipts fee model, how do we ensure that the information is accurate? So what we have here is an excellent example of what this is, where on the form they have stated that underestimating their receipts is liable to a 50% penalty. The way this is enforced is in the Code of Ordinances for the city. It states clearly that the tax collectors have it within their power to ask for additional information on the accounts, and if they find that you have underestimated your gross receipts, then you're liable to this additional penalty of 50% on gross receipts. So these two tables here that I'll show you now are just getting at the revenue that could be potentially generated by modifying the business license fee schedule. And as we can see here, the last three cities, Menlo Park, San Mateo, and East Palo Alto, that do have this fee model tend to generate more income than the ones that don't. So what would this look like for Redwood City? We wanted to see if we could model this transformation specific to the city. This was done with the help of the SUS data set. So we took all the rental properties within Redwood City and were able to aggregate their the estimated revenues, which was about 362 million. And this is applied to all rental properties in Redwood City. So this is ranging from 1 unit to about 50. And there were about 15,000 units that were counted in that population. Then we were able to restrict this to the businesses that would be subject to this business license fee. And this was about 6,000 units and in excess of 3 units per property. And we're able to get a total estimated revenue of 160.7 million, which would be subject to this business license fee. So how do we get at least the same amount as we're getting now with the current fee schedule? So what we did here is just a very simple calculation where we took this estimated revenue that would be subject to the fee and divided it by the current amount being generated that I mentioned earlier, which is 180,000. And what we got is a percentage rate to charge of 0.1%. And we found this to be akin to the the rates charged in the other cities like Menlo Park and San Mateo. So what are some of the limitations? Now these limitations don't apply to the first step, as we also confirmed yesterday with the committee that they're already in conversation with the city council to add the line on the business license to ask for gross receipts. These limitations apply to what it looks like to transform the business license fee schedule to a gross receipts model. So we have 5 limitations. First and foremost, that the rental revenues that we have here were based on a set of assumptions, and this is because we don't have that information readily available, and that is why we're really advocating for the inclusion of this line on the business license forms so that we can have more accurate information going forward. The second limitation we have is legal. If we were to transform any taxation fee schedule, it would have to be put to a vote and would need to consult the city attorney, which we didn't have time to do. The third one is political will, and this is tying back to the requirement of a public vote to make this change. Our fourth limitation is looking at the revenue that it generates, which is relatively small to the need highlighted earlier by Janelle and Amadou. And our final limitation is that the city profiles that we looked at are slightly different, even though they're located within the same county. Of particular note is East Palo Alto, which has chosen to implement rent control, which Janelle mentioned earlier was not in the plans for Redwood City. So finally, some further considerations, if there was time, was looking at more directly getting at putting these dollars from the residential properties in the business license towards preventing displacement. As it stands, all business license revenues are directed towards a general fund, but as passed by East Palo Alto in 2016, they have adopted a measure where they divert these funds for residential properties in excess of 5 units directly to the Affordable Housing Fund so that these dollars can be put back into preventing displacement and homelessness.
So now we're going to move towards the rights of first notification and first refusal. So essentially these policies adhere to two of the issues that we were addressing, so the data issue and the reducing the rate of displacement. So what is the notification and the first refusal? So for the notification piece, this essentially is a requirement from the city stating that if you're interested in selling your property, you must notify the city in a allotted time. So typically this notification period is 90 days. And now for the right of first refusal, in this 90-day period, the city can now go in and make a decision whether or not they're trying to acquire the unit in order to maintain permanent affordability. So for this certain section, we decided to look at 3 cities. We looked at San Francisco, Portland, and Washington, D.C., and I'm now about to go into those different frameworks to kind of get an understanding of how does this work in practice. So first we'll start with San Francisco. So this was actually implemented in 1990, and essentially the way this works is that if a certain property is interested in selling their unit or their specific property, then they contact the city or a local or qualified entity such as a tenant organization, a nonprofit, or any other entity that the city deems is necessary or has the qualifications to then make a deal and say whether or not they're going to acquire the unit. And so something that's very interesting about this is that this specific policy is actually for subsidized properties. And so that even though in this presentation we are looking at non-subsidized properties, it's an interesting practice that is implemented that they actually use an 18-month period rather than the 90-day notification that other cities use. So again, with Washington, D.C., implemented in 1998, they do use this 90-day notification period, and instead of having a more wide range of qualified entities, they use tenant associations. So if a property is interested to be up for sale, they notify 90 days prior, contact the tenant association then goes in, makes a deal of whether or not they're going to acquire. Lastly, we have Portland, which was implemented in 1980. And again, there is also a 90-day notification policy, notification period. This is primarily through the city. So out of the 3 jurisdictions, this is the one city that's more, the cities has the most involvement in. So that was just kind of interesting to gather. And I think out of these 3 jurisdictions, some of the smart practices that I noticed was that one, with San Francisco, with the subsidized properties, they did have an 18-month period, and I think given the housing market today, I think that's very interesting to allow the city to have enough time to make a decision and make an adequate decision based off of the high costs in this particular market. And another key factor is the fact that they use other designees, right, to carry out this issue, because I think that there is additional administrative supervision that's required in this particular policy, so that's definitely something to take into consideration. So now looking into, like zooming out and looking at the advantages and disadvantages to the notification component. So for the notification, some of the advantages are the idea that we can attack this data shortage head on, right? We're able to have this live mapping of units that are being converted to affordable housing. We can even potentially forecast units right before they are potentially going to be converted to market rate, so that we can go in and attack and have the opportunity to acquire the land in order to maintain permanent affordability. Now, one of the disadvantages, what I mentioned earlier, was the fact that it does require additional administrative supervision. So it's something that's definitely important that the city and the client needs to take into consideration. And also the resistance from private owners, right? So some individuals may not know whether or not they are interested, or may not know whether or not they're going to sell in a 90-day period or even an 18-month period. So I think it's very important and critical that there's input gotten from different interest groups, such as nonprofits, real estate, and other advocacy groups to get a better understanding of the needs and wants of the different landlords. Now, for the right of first refusal, in terms of advantages, it is head-on attacking the decreasing rate of displacement and maintaining permanent affordability by acquiring these different units. Now, a disadvantage, in which I'm going to go in later, is financing this policy. Some of the major costs include the acquisition, the improvement costs, and also the administrative costs. And in this presentation, I'll go further into the more acquisition costs in the next slides. And lastly, a big disadvantage is discouraging future affordable housing development, because there could be an idea that with this type of policy being in place, people might have the conception that all affordable housing will now be solved with this, and we may not necessarily need a need for future development, which is not true at all. Now let's go into the analysis. So something that we wanted to give the client was a general understanding of how much would it cost to theoretically purchase all potential NOAA units. Now, we do understand that they're not going to go in today and go buy all of the units, but what would it seem like to have an average price of what a particular NOAA unit would be? So some of the assumptions that we had was based off some of the characteristics of what NOAA is, and based off of other cities. We used multifamily units built before 1983, which we got from the Portland jurisdiction, and 5 or more units, which we got from Washington, D.C. So how did we run this regression? So we decided to run this regression to understand how the last sale amount affects these different independent variables listed above. So year built, number of building stories, number of units, number of bedrooms, net value, land value, improvement value, and tax amount. Now I understand that seems like a very exhaustive list, but the goal was, because we did not have rent data in this particular data set, we needed to figure out a way to get a better understanding of what these properties actually look like. So by using as many different characteristics as possible to better understand what this ideal sale price would be for acquisition. And so we decided to use recent sale prices from 2013 to 2017 to then predict what the average sale price would be for units or properties that were built before 1983 with units with properties with 5 or more units. So what we ended up getting was that the predicted sale amount was about $18.4 million to acquire a multifamily property. Now, and the max sale amount was $21.4 million. Now, I understand this seems like a very big figure, but I want to rest assured that this range was from 5 units all the way to 293 units. So this was a very wide range, so that's the reason why there is such a high number. Now, looking at future considerations, we do need to understand that the SUS data that we received was not perfect. There was many missing observations, so we did have to remove those. So that definitely has skewed our results. Administration logistics, this does require severe amounts of administration supervision, making sure that there's accurate return time in terms of the offer that's being submitted in whatever time span that the city ends up deciding. And also, it's very critical that they build partnerships with different qualified entities, such as tenant associations, nonprofits such as MidPen and Habitat Humanity, to make to make this a sustainable practice, because I think that even though we can make some justification to the value that we just mentioned, it still is a very high number, and I definitely think that we do need outside support in order to make this possible. Now, earlier in the presentation, Janelle mentioned the Stratford property, and where that particular landlord had the ability to maintain affordable housing on her own. And I think that's a very unique case for a landlord to take ownership for themselves. And so I definitely think that we need to make this practice as turnkey as possible. So figuring out ways to aid the process and make it as accessible as possible. And this is where we introduce the property transfer to nonprofits. This definitely tackles reducing the rate of displacement. And the reason why it does this is because we do understand, and we want to remind everyone here, that preservation is cheaper and it's much quicker. And if we go through the method of nonprofits, we have some interesting findings from here. So if a nonprofit uses public funding, then they're fully exempt from property taxes, which is then significantly reduces the cost for them in terms of acquiring units. And if they're exclusively financed, then they're exempt up to 20 million of property assessed values. And so this actually works in our favor because based off of the mean that we found in our regressions of 18.4, it does allow certain nonprofits on average to be exempt. And so for the rest of the presentation, or for this particular recommendation, I'm going to pass it on to Amadou so where he goes off to the different logistics.
So in terms of methodology, we first needed to identify the number of multifamily properties and units. So just to have more visibility in what the landscape looks like in terms of the number of NOAA units. And then with this particular recommendation, we needed to also filter the database for NOAA characteristics. So we looked at recently sold properties, so after 2013, and this database involves using the SUS database, which our engineering team provided for us. We also looked at units that were owned by non-LLC owners. Usual characteristic of NOAA units is involves sole proprietorship. And then just like the Portland study, we looked at homes that were built before 1983. So in terms of deliverables with this recommendation, my team was able to estimate the foregone property tax revenue, and we wanted to know like how much revenue would the city lose or the county lose and see what that percentage was like. And then also aside from that, we created a list of likely NOAA landlords and nonprofit partners. We felt as if some nonprofits had great reputations for building affordable housing within the city, and some NOAA landlords had a lot of units that could potentially be converted to nonprofit housing. And then we also created a flow chart depicting the process that Christina experienced. So transferring the property from commercial ownership into nonprofit housing. And another thing that I want to mention, yesterday in our client meeting, they talked about how renter protection was actually sometimes hurting people because after a lease is done, I guess owners felt as if they can just charge as much as they could to account for future years. So I think if you transfer your property to nonprofit housing, people who actually are motivated or people who want to maintain affordability, then this is a great approach to take. In terms of the summary of our research findings,